All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a massive historical debate surrounding the biblical figure Abraham. Specifically, we're analyzing the source material's defense against claims of textual anachronisms. Now, if you need a quick refresher, an anachronism is basically something placed in the wrong time period. Think of it like spotting a knight in shining armor checking his smartphone. Some critics argue the text about Abraham is full of these historical mismatches, but the source we're looking at today presents a highly structured, point-by-point defense against those claims.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to look at the overall evidence problem first, and then tackle three very specific historical mysteries: the camel debate, the Philistine question, and Ur of the Chaldeans. Finally, we'll wrap things up by weighing ancient memory against later editing.
Okay, part 1. The evidence problem. Did Abraham actually exist?
Right off the bat, the source material makes a pretty startling admission. There is absolutely zero direct archaeological evidence for Abraham as a literal individual. No tombs, no ancient inscriptions, nothing. But, as the source is quick to point out, a lack of physical artifacts doesn't automatically mean somebody is fictional. Think about it. Historians widely accept the existence of figures like the poet Homer, or Pythagoras, the math guy. We haven't dug up their bones either. We accept they were real based on incredibly strong, coherent textual traditions rather than direct archaeological digs.
So the crucial point the source establishes here, and they quote scholar Dr. Martin Heidegger on this, is that classic saying, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Basically, we have to look really closely at the internal evidence and cultural context of the text itself, rather than just throwing it out because we haven't found something in the dirt yet. Moving on to part 2, the camel debate, a question of chronology.
So our first big academic critique is all about camels, specifically domesticated camels showing up in the Genesis narrative. Critics always point to this highly publicized 2013 Tel Aviv University study. They carbon-dated camel bones found in these southern copper mines to the 10th century BC, which is like 1,000 years after Abraham supposedly lived. Because of this, people argue the text is a massive anachronism, but the source argues this is a total regional fallacy. That study really only proves when camels were used for copper transport in that one specific southern region, not the whole Near East. In fact, experts trace domesticated Bactrian camels in the broader region all the way back to the 3rd millennium BC. And to back this up, the source actually points to verifiable museum artifacts from the exact era of the patriarchs. You could literally go see these yourself. The Walters Art Museum in Baltimore has this cylinder seal from between 1800 and 1650 BC that clearly shows a two-humped camel with a divine couple. And even crazier, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has a copper camel figurine from the late 3rd or early 2nd millennium BC. And the key detail here, it features a harness. A harness means only one thing, right? The animal was working for humans. So the source concludes they were definitely domesticated long before the 10th century BC.
All right, part 3, the Philistine question, 2 distinct eras. Our second mystery is about Abraham interacting with a group called the Philistines. Critics love to point out that the Philistines didn't arrive in Canaan until around 1200 BC, about 8 centuries after Abraham. But the source pushes back hard here, drawing on Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen. Kitchen points out that the text actually describes 2 completely different groups of people. Abraham's Philistines were ruled by a single king with a Canaanite name, and they just lived in one city. But the later Philistines, like from the era of Goliath, were this massive confederation of 5 lords across 5 distinct cities with foreign names. The argument is, if a later writer was just inventing history out of thin air, they would have definitely described the 5-city confederation they were actually familiar with.
So why call both groups Philistines? Well, the source explains this using a literary concept called prolepsis. That's basically when you use a familiar, later geographic name for an ancient place so your current readers actually know what you're talking about. The source gives a brilliant analogy for this. It's like saying ancient native settlers arrived in New York thousands of years ago. Obviously, it wasn't called New York back then, but we say that so you know exactly where we mean. It's highly likely early scribes just updated the regional names in the ancient text so their readers could follow the map.
Which brings us to part 4, Ur of the Chaldeans, people versus empire.
The third major attack the source analyzes is about Abraham leaving a place called Ur of the Chaldeans. Critics argue this is a glaring anachronism, because the Great Chaldean Empire didn't become a political superpower until the 1st millennium BC, way after Abraham. But the source argues critics are confusing a later political empire with an earlier tribal group. The Chaldean people actually existed as a nomadic tribe long before they ever built their famous Neo-Babylonian empire. Think of it like this. It's like saying the Romans didn't exist before the Roman Empire was officially established. The people were definitely there before the political borders were drawn.
On top of that, the source offers a really practical secondary explanation that ties right back into that idea of prolepsis we just talked about. See, there were actually multiple ancient cities named So a later editor, maybe a scribe like Joshua or Ezra, probably just added the tag of the Chaldeans to distinguish the famous southern from the other ones. It's essentially an ancient map update. It's an editorial clarification to help the reader, not a historical error or somebody making up events. Okay, our final section, Part 5, Ancient Memory versus Editing, Preserving the Middle Bronze Age.
This really brings us to the overarching thesis of the source material. We have to distinguish between the time a text was finally edited and the actual historical reality it's describing. The source argues that if the story of Abraham was completely fabricated 1,000 years later, it would be almost impossible for a writer to accidentally guess these highly specific details of the Middle Bronze Age that had long since fallen out of use. I mean, patriarchal names perfectly match Amorite naming patterns from the early 2nd millennium BC. Specific legal customs in Genesis have incredibly strong parallels to actual archaeological finds, like the Marian Nuzi tablets. And the political structures? They reflect early semi-nomadic alliances, completely different from the massive empires of later eras.
As a prime example of this crazy precision, the source highlights one specific detail. The narrative records the price of a slave at exactly 20 shekels of silver. That is a highly specific economic data point, and it aligns perfectly with the known economic records of the 2000 BC era. By the time of the later centuries, when critics claim this text was invented, inflation had driven slave prices way up. A later writer making up a story would almost certainly have just used the higher prices of their own day. So, after analyzing this defense, the final provocative thought we have to leave you with is this. Does the presence of minor editorial updates over the centuries, things like modernizing a city name so later readers can find it on a map, does that really invalidate the remarkably accurate, culturally precise history preserved at the core of the text? The source makes a compelling case that while editors may have dusted off the text over time, the historical core remains firmly anchored in the ancient Middle Bronze Age. And that wraps up our explainer on this really fascinating historical debate. Thanks so much for exploring it with us.